Hello and welcome to my tutorial on how to make a log cabin wall hanging. I will be showing you how to make one using dragonflies, but you can use any of the Sea Parrot animal strips. You need 3 animal squares from Sea Parrot animal strips. I'm going to be using the dragonflies. You can use the damselflies, the birds or the woodland mammals. It's entirely up to you. So you also need a selection of different fabrics to make the outer log cabin strips. To go with the dragonflies, I decided to use my river collection, which has 8 different fabrics. You also need some fabric for the sashing or border. You need some wadding, the backing fabric and some binding, which you can buy or you make yourself. So first of all, cut your animal squares using the markings down to 4 inches square, then cut them accurately to 3.5 inches square, making sure that the animal is in the centre. Then cut some strips from the other fabrics, 1.25 inches wide, and make sure you cut some vertically and some horizontally if the fabric has direction. Cut a piece of fabric just wider than your central square, making sure it's in the right direction. Place it right sides together. Then you need to pin it and sew with a 1/4 inch seam along the side. You can then open it out and press the seam away from the central square. Next, you then need to trim off the little excess pieces. Take another strip and cut it longer than the square and the sewn piece. Pin it and sew it again with a 1/4 inch seam. Press the seam away from the central square and then trim off the excess pieces. And this is what you will do all the way around. So take another piece, cut it longer than the sewn pieces, make sure it's in the right direction, place it right sides together, pin and sew all the way along. Press the seam away from the central square and cut off the excess. And you can see I've made sure that the willow is facing the right direction, hanging down. Then take your next piece, pin and sew all the way along. Press the seam away and then cut off the excess pieces. And that's your first round done. So now you need to start all over again at the top, making sure the fabric's in the right direction, pin and sew, and press the seam again away from the central square. Cut off the excess pieces. It's a much more accurate way of doing it rather than measuring a piece and cutting it to the size. Then do the same with the side. This time I've got some purple loosestrife. I'm going to pin and sew it. And then open it out and press the seam away from the central square and cut off the excess pieces. Now for the bottom piece, we've got the minnows here, making sure they're in the right, they're not upside down or anything, and they're in the right direction. Right sides together, open it out, press the seam away from the central square and then cut off the excess pieces. You can get into a nice rhythm because you're just repeating the same process over and over again. I like doing things like that, it's quite relaxing. So right sides together, pin and sew, and press the seam allowance away from the central square and then cut off the excess. That's your second round done. So now you're on the last round. Back to the top again, right sides together, pin and sew, Open it out and press the seam away from the central square and cut off the excess. So you can see I cut the weeping willow vertically this time, so the willow's still hanging downwards. Pin and sew. Open it out. Press the seam allowance away from the central square and trim. Bottom strip this time. Pin and sew. Open it out and press the seam allowance away from the central square. Trim off the excess. And then this is your last piece. Another piece of purple loosestrife. Right sides together. Pin and sew with a 1/4 inch seam. Open it out and press the seam allowance away and trim off. And that's your first block done. So now you need to repeat this for the other 2 dragonflies in this case. That's my second block. And then that's my third block. You then put them in the order that you want to have them on your wall hanging, and now it's time to add the sashing. So I cut strips that were 1 3/4 inches wide, and I used a plain fabric that I just found in my local shop. It's much a similar method. I cut 2 strips just longer than each side, put them right sides together, pin and sew, open it out and press the seam away from the central square again. And then you need to trim off the excess. And then repeat for the top and bottom for your first square. Pin and sew and press the seams away from the central square. I didn't trim it off this time because I'm going to do that at the end because I think I'll make it more accurate. So then you need to repeat this for the other 2 blocks, but this time only doing it on the sides and the bottom, and then sew it all together. This is the back. It shows you all the seams lovely pressed, all going outwards. And now you need to quilt. So you've got your topper on top of your piece of batting, which I've cut just bigger, and then that's on top of the backing fabric, which is just bigger than the same size as the batting. I've pinned it all together and then I've tacked it all together, and now I am going to quilt it. I hand quilted, but you could use machine if you want to. I quilted around each of the dragonflies to start off with. And then I quilted 2 rows in each of the log cabin strips, going round in a square. Next, you need to add your binding, and I added a loop, or you might want to hang a small hanging sleeve. And this is the finished wall hanging, all nicely quilted. And then I put a light blue contrasting binding. I just bought some bias binding from my local shop, but you can make your own if you want to. And that's your wall hanging all finished. Thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed it.